is Sri Lanka, and that's the Prime Minister's house that is now on fire. Actually, maybe it's burned to ash now. Either way, it's been burning for a while. And do you remember back in May of 2022, a gentleman you may recognize, Bryan Dean Wright, came on the show, and he had this to say?
India, normally a big exporter to the world. Unfortunately, they're having tremendous amounts of problems in terms of weather. They're not getting a crop this year, so they can't export to make up for all the loss that would have otherwise come from Russia and Ukraine. So, for instance, they usually send wheat to a little country called Sri Lanka, just south of India itself. They are down about 40% from their wheat supplies. That's feeding riots, and indeed, the prime minister of that country was thrown out because of it. So a big impact that we are seeing in places in Asia. Indonesia is another big place as well.
That is what you call calling your shot right there. Bryan Dean Wright, host of course, the great President's Daily Brief podcast. Less than 20 minutes. You're caught up on the news every single day. Bryan, look, as a man who loves to gloat and say, I told you so, I'm just going to let you, look, you round the bases at whatever pace you feel like rounding the bases. Bryan, please take it away.
Look, some people call me Nostradamus. It's true. Others call me Miss Cleo. She's also famous from the 90s. The resemblance pretty striking, as you can tell. I'm a big deal. Not as big as you, Jesse, but I try.
All right. In all seriousness, you called it, but explain why we're seeing what we're seeing. Let's be frank, no disrespect to them. Most Americans could not even find Sri Lanka on a map and don't have any idea why this may in any way be relevant to them. They just see another country somewhere having some political problems. What are we looking at?
Yeah, so you start this out exactly as we should. Why do we care? Well, we're about to dive into it, and I want people to really listen and think, hey, that kind of sounds like some stuff that America is going through. That's the scary part of this. Sri Lanka used to be a pretty rich country in South Asia. And guess what? They went from rich to, you can see, storming the president's palace. So here we go. There are three big reasons that you're seeing this happen. First, debt. Right? So for about 10 years, the regime in Sri Lanka, which was actually quite loved and embraced, they took on tons and tons, billions of dollars worth of debt. Well, that's a problem in no small part when you can't start paying it off, right? And by the way, the debt is controlled, at least 10% of it, if not more, by China. United States, just as an aside, the communists control over $1 trillion of our debt. So nevertheless, so we've got all this debt in Sri Lanka. The second thing, COVID. So the Sri Lankan government locks down its country. Well, that's a problem because they really need tourist dollars. Well, they went down 91% on the number of tourists who came into the country. And that means a massive revenue source just disappeared within weeks. All right, so now we've got massive debt. We've got no income or very little income, but the income that the Sri Lankans did have came from agriculture. So brilliantly, the Sri Lankans said, let's go to organic farming. The environmentalists were pushing the Sri Lankan government to embrace organic farming, and they did. Overnight, they said all fertilizers and all pesticides were illegal, banned them. So you have 30% of Sri Lankans who are involved in the ag community, farmers who wake up one morning and suddenly they can't farm anymore, or at least they have no, pesticides, no fertilizers to make their crops grow. Well, what do you think happened? Well, anybody who is a farmer, or you have to be a farmer to know what's probably going to happen next, yields collapse. 70% of reduction in yields for things like rice. Well, that's a big deal because Sri Lankans really consume a lot of rice and they export it to get that foreign exchange or that money, right? So now the Sri Lankans have very massive amounts of debt. They have no tourist money, and they just kneecap themselves with having no ag industry, and they can't feed themselves. So now they're importing all kinds of food. Well, that leads up to the last couple months to include the wheat wars. They're running out of wheat and rice and lots of other things. They have very few crops left to export. And now the government gets tossed out. Buildings are burning down. The presidential palace is occupied by people who are hanging out in the bathroom and the pool, enjoying themselves. So it's a mess. That country went from one of the richest to one of the poorest, in fact, in the midst of anarchy.
Bryan, should we care? I mean, on a global level, obviously, setting aside the violence and stuff there, should we worry about things like this spreading to places that do matter a lot to us personally, speaking selfishly as an American?
Yeah. So I think what this is sort of like the canary in the coal mine, where you're starting to see a lot of countries out there in the world who have a lot of debt, who have struggled or suffered because of COVID lockdowns and COVID policies that were really silly. And now we have this sort of Green New Deal idea. It's been floating around for a while, the World Economic Forum really pushing it. So you have this global machinery that's kind of pushing in the same direction that Sri Lanka has gone in. And that's what I think is really concerning. There are countries that are following the course of the World Economic Forum and others, this whole green climate change stuff. Again, think what you will about carbon dioxide emissions and so forth. The point is, if you don't manage all of that process well, you could be in big trouble. So our trade partners, the people who import the stuff that we create, keep our factories churning, if those governments start going under and you start having these little mini revolutions, yeah, it's a really big deal for Americans because they need our stuff and we want to sell it to them. But that's pretty hard when the country is erupting and they have no fuel, they have no food, and there's anarchy everywhere.
Don't miss Jesse Kelly Breaks History, Che Guevara, the latest episode of a new series available now exclusively for First TV supporters. Visit the First TV app or thefirsttv.com to subscribe and start watching today.